Okay. Hi, Jeffrey. How are you? Welcome to the show.
Hello, Douglas. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to have you here. I was reading through your bio. It sounded very interesting. You've got three books out. Is that correct? And Whiskey Rebel is the third.
Yes,
Is this a trilogy or are they three completely standalone separate books?
three completely different literary fiction books.
Okay. It also says that you wrote all three books within the last few years. What have you been doing prior to that?
For 41 years, I was a secondary English school teacher and worked in and taught students in Pittsburgh and parochial schools and Washington State, a little bit in Ohio. But I've written since I was 14 years old. So once I retired, I could focus on kind of what I'm most comfortable doing, which is writing, being creative. Although I totally loved all the time I had with my students, but they got as kids are. There's a certain point where they have more energy than you do, and it was time to turn them over to someone else.
What age kids were you teaching?
Yeah, nine grades 9 through 12, 14 to 18.
Oh, that's yeah.
Yep. And
Okay.
I focused, I have a PhD in English and culture studies, but I really focused on kids who struggle with reading and writing, who are two grade levels and more below, and trying to engineer ways to support them, help them graduate, figure out ways to do improvement, but just allow them to survive school when it gets harder and harder each year.
Before we pivot over to your book, I want to open up that topic just a little
Sure.
bit about reading and illiteracy. Why is it, do you think, that some kids just have difficulty reading? Is it like an eyesight issue? Is it uh, a muscular coordination issue? Is it what is it? Psychological?
Oh, well, first of all, it's all those things,
Okay.
but globally, primarily genetically, we don't have reading genes, and so the brain has to be trained, what people call neuroplasticity, and because this is the skill that we were never meant to have. Mathematics is worse, but we won't get into the whole math side of things. Reading and writing is simply a skill that is a miracle that human beings can do it. Um, and so it's not going to be a surprise that there's a spectrum of abilities. Some brains are going to adapt better to that environment, and some aren't. I'm dyslexic, and I can speak, and my PR team has told me not to talk about dyslexia too much because I can go on for an hour or two. But I'm dyslexic. It's a spectrum disorder. 15% of the population is dyslexic. And depending upon the severity, creates reading issues. And then there's ADHD, ADD, other sorts of autism, sorts of just differences in the way our brains are constructed. And since I'm dyslexic and had an autistic son, I I was very called empathy, I guess. Um, it was just fascinating to me, and I come from an engineering sort of family, so being able to engineer ways to um, allow students' brains to develop and survive literacy, and find their way into adulthood was just a joy. Let's put it that way.
I'm just curious if the more you read, the better you will get at it, or not necessarily.
Depends. Again, it all depends
It
on
all depends on,
all,
yeah.
yeah, we kind of assume everybody's the same, but if you work in this kind of field, you'll realize that there are vast differences in the way our brains, like personalities, our brains just function so much differently because of our experience and our genetics and the way they all come together. Practice is important, of course. If you don't do something, you're not good at it. That's not a hard thing. But if you keep doing things that you're bad at, it's like I always use this as an analogy. Imagine someone who needs a wheelchair and then just demanding that they practice basketball all day. Well, they're only going to get so good because their legs don't function the way that somebody who has, functional legs works. So that's just
Right.
not going to work.
Okay.
Yeah.
So one size does not fit all, in other
No, not
words.
at all.
Yeah.
Not even close. But there's a developmental sequence. And so that what I did with high school kids that were like 3, 4, 2 grade levels below, there's a developmental process and you have to go back and work on those things in the developmental process that makes a good reader. And so vocabulary, phonics, there are things you can do, and if you scale it down, you'll get stronger. I mean, you'll never be an all-star, but you get better. But if you force somebody to do something that's frustration level, all you do is learn to hate it, and then you just refuse.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Good
it's
point.
dialing it back. And my high school colleagues, very 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 well meaning all the time, but very few of them want to dial it back and teach elementary to high school kids. And you have to do it in such a way that high school kids don't rebel because they don't want to be treated like children. So it's, there's a bit of an art
Okay. Well,
to square in that circle.
let's pivot over to your book, Whiskey Rebel.
Sure.
Give
Yeah,
us give us a synopsis, if you would.
sure. Uh, it came out of uh, I'm a setting is very important to me. I'm a writer of place, and places just speak to me. And there's a place called Moses Coulee in Central Washington. It's kind of like being on the moon. And I got it into my head that wouldn't it be interesting if we had a couple of sort of like on the road characters who decided they were going to make tax-free whiskey there. And so there are these two drifters, and they come together, and how that relationship builds. One of them is historically thinks he's directly descendant to the American Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, and he thinks this is his lot in life. And the other one's an Iraqi war veteran who, through an IED explosion, got his brain scrambled. And so they team up here, and then it's just that story and the other people in the area. It's only singular people live in an area like this. And the two women and a Native American who becomes part of their circle, and how they learn from each other and bicker with each other, and from a globally essentially are sorting out what does it mean to be free, what does it mean in the United States, what does it mean to pursue the American dream when it's clearly going to be different from everybody. It's not a one size fit all. Just like reading we talked about. It's an individual thing.
Two things came to mind while you were speaking. First was the location that you were talking about. Was this
Yes,
someplace
sir.
that got wiped out by Mount St. Helens, and that's why it looks like the moon?
Good question. It's not a Mount St. Helens issue, but it could have been because it's not all that far away. What happened in the Ice Age was there's a lake called Pend Oreille, which is huge, and ice sheets came down and they created dams. And there was a dam that formed near Sandpoint, Idaho, that backed up all the way into Montana, the size of one of our Great Lakes. Well, as you can imagine, at some point when things warmed up, global warming, what it is, that ice dam broke, and that entire lake came right through northern Idaho, came right over Spokane, fanned out over central Washington, stripped all the soil off of a lot of places, and ended up finally in the Columbia River and out into the ocean. Walla Walla sweet onions are grown in the soil, I like to think, where I live in Spokane, that was taken away. And the Willamette Valley is a whole lot of Washington State soil where they grow lots of vegetables and fruits and those sorts of things. And And there's a huge 200-mile plume out into the Pacific from the Columbia. Again, soil, that would have been right where I live. So it really creates this interesting spot backwards for wheat farming, because all the good soil's on top of the hills where the flood didn't touch it, and all the soil's been stripped off down low. Farmers usually like, bottomland, where the good soil is. There isn't any in central Washington. It's all gone.
The second thought that I had while you were describing your book was Of Mice and Men.
Okay.
Is there any parallel to that Steinbeck story?
That's not something I thought of. But I see what you're. I mean, it's a buddy novel, so to speak. So I get that. This is this kind of picaresque. My original thought was Richard Brautigan's A Confederate General from the Big Sur. These two characters, somewhere in that mold, sort of smart alecky types with big ideas, and also on the road, where the two characters, one's the more writerly type and one's the more whose his life is the novel. He doesn't write the novel like Neil Cassidy, he is the novel. So, and that's kind of set up this way. There's somebody who's the Punxie, who's a pun on a place in Pennsylvania where the Punxsutawney Phil comes from.
Oh, the groundhog.
The groundhog, yeah.
Yeah.
His parents named him that because they thought it was funny. He's the person trying to figure out what's going on and reporting on the whiskey rebel, who's Hamilton Chance, and he's the one who's on the edge of mental illness. It's always a question. He has to always kind of figure out whether this guy who wants to make the tax-free whiskey is simply really interesting and different and might be onto something as a business, or whether he's just nuts. And we stay on that edge throughout the entire novel. Is Hamilton crazy or not? And he has to keep thinking about that.
I've met quite a few people like that in my life.
Yeah.
I always had to question their sanity.
Yeah. And this area of the country is where people like that go. So where I've taught, here in the Spokane area, and then on the west side, Elma, a logging community, and that's discussed in some length in the book, is the kinds of people who leave, more integrated society because they're just more comfortable, where they can let their freak flag fly, so to speak.
Okay, well, that's well said. What genre would you put this book in?
Well, it's literary fiction.
Okay.
And it's this kind of this one's a simpler read. This one is more comic, and filled with puns and craziness, and characters who are just kind of off the wall, bouncing off one another. Much more that way than my other two books. Although all of them have something to do with freedom, all of them have something to do with America, and all of them have something to do with plate. So there's commonalities, but the places are different, and the way I treat the material is different.
We've got just about 1 minute left. Has Whiskey Rebel been released?
It's right now. It's on Amazon, on Kindle, and so the ebook is there. It's up for pre-order anywhere. From your local bookstore, you can pre-order it, or online, Barnes and Noble, whatever. The print release, where you can actually get a copy, will be May 6th. So we're coming up on that.
Okay. Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming on this show. And the last question is, do you have a website that you want to give out?
Oh, yes, sir. JeffreyDunnSpokane.com. I live in Spokane, Washington, so it's easy to remember. JeffreyDunnSpokane.com.
Okay, great. Again, thank you for coming on. Nice meeting you. Best of luck with your work.
Nice to meet you. Been a pleasure, sir.